Hi everyone, and thank you ever so much for joining us for today's session. It's really wonderful to have such a large audience here today, and judging from the poll, we have people joining us from quite a few different countries around the world, which is also really, really lovely to see. So just to quickly introduce myself to start off with, my name is Tanya and I'll be chairing today's session. I am a recent UCL graduate, so I did a BA in English and French, which is, I suppose, maybe a bit unusual for someone who's interested in sustainability. I also was the student media representative and former president of the UCL Film and TV Society. Last summer, I moderated a webinar jointly organized by the British Council and the University PSL titled Reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, Universities and Students Looking for Solutions. And most recently, I also spoke on session 2 of this conference last week, titled Universities and the SDGs, which I think was a really, really, really great session, which challenged universities to consider whether and how they should be implementing the SDGs and what the role of the higher education sector actually is when it comes to sustainability. We also asked the all important question of what does the next generation of students, which is you guys, actually expect from their higher education institutions? Now, we'll be following all of these questions up with today's session, aptly called Students Beyond Boundaries. I think that today's session is very special and a little bit different to some of the others, as it's almost entirely student focused and student led. We really, really want to hear your perspective. And today we have 5 wonderful speakers joining us today who will have slightly different angle and a slightly different experience when it comes to the SDGs and sustainability. So if we all go around and do a round of introductions, first up we have May Fougère, who is the former Students' Union Sustainability Officer at UCL. So May, if you'd like to just say a few words about yourself.
Hi everyone. Well, Tanya said, last year I was the Student Sustainability Officer for the Students' Union at UCL. I was also in my last year of a philosophy and history of art degree. There are 3 initiatives which I launched and which I think are of particular relevance to the discussion today. I created the Student Sustainability Council for students to be able to review policies taken by the university and potentially improve them. I created the Students' Sustainability Ambassadors Program, which intends to place students within the university and Students' Union administration for them to have the power to make a change. And I'm currently working on the climate education kickoff at UCL and in other countries in the world, which intends to train everyone on those issues which are of particular importance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, May. It's great to hear from you. Next up, we have Isha Kulkarni, who is also a recent UCL graduate. So Isha, if you'd like to also say a few words about your work.
Sure, thanks, Tanya. So my name is Isha Kulkarni. I just graduated with a degree in civil engineering. While I was at UCL, I was the president of Engineers Without Borders. And throughout my time at UCL, as well as during my exchange year, I have done a lot of different kinds of sustainability projects, taken a lot of sustainability courses, and this is something that's really close to my heart. Currently, I am also working in the sustainability space, so I feel like I can also add to that from that perspective.
Thank you so much, Isha, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your perspective. Next up, we have Professor Jane Holder, who is the Professor of Environmental Law at UCL. Jane, if you'd like to say a few words about yourself as well.
Hello, hi. I teach environmental law, sustainability and environmental justice at the Faculty of Laws here at UCL. I've taught for quite a long time, but I've been involved in sustainability literacy work for a long while too. Most recently, with colleagues in geography and engineering, I held an environmental justice inquiry into environmental impacts in Somerstown area and Euston. And I'm also involved in developing a partnership with the Environmental Law Foundation. So those aspects are from a legal perspective. I'm interested more generally in sustainability, and I'm a member of the Sustainability Literacy Working Group at UCL.
Thank you so much, Jane, and we're very lucky to have you here today. She will bring a wealth of experience and knowledge to the discussion. Thank you. Next up, we have Barney Eiley. So Barney is currently a UCL student at the Bartley School of Architecture. So Barney, if you'd like to talk a bit more about yourself.
Hi, I'm Barney. I'm a second year architecture student. In my first year, along with some other architecture students at other architecture schools around the UK, helped to set up a campaign called Architecture Education Declares, which was aiming to increase the prominence of architectural education's focus on the environment and the impact of construction on the environment and things like that. And now I study with Unit 1, as they say in architecture school. So they are practitioners who think a lot about these kinds of things as well. So I'm very immersed in it.
Thank you very much, Barney. And finally, we have Lincoln Lee, who is another UCL recent graduate who co-founded a social enterprise called Rice Inc. So Lincoln, if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Lincoln. I also recently graduated from UCL last year by the biomedical sciences. So while I was at UCL, I helped co-founder with a couple of course mates a social enterprise called Rice Inc. And what we do is we aim to tackle food waste in the rice industry by helping rice farmers in Southeast Asia get access to more sustainable agriculture technologies. And so while at UCL, we managed to represent UCL at a competition called the Hulk Prize, organized by the UN for their, which focuses on different SDGs every year. And we actually managed to win it. So they gave us a grant of $1 million to continue our work. And so now we're working on it full time. And so I guess, yeah, so we work a lot in the sustainability sector, and a lot of our partners are people who do research on the SDGs or work in companies focused on sustainability.
Thank you so much, Lincoln. So as I said before, I think it's really, really wonderful to have such a diverse panel with us here today. And as we can see from the audience poll, it's really great to have students studying such different subjects as well. It's really, really nice. And I think, as I said earlier, we really, really do value your opinion. So we'll be putting up various polls throughout the session today. So please do answer those if you wish. Now, to start off the discussion, we wanted to ask the question of what do you think a university education is actually for? Now, Isha, I wanted to pose that question to you first. So it'd be really, really great if you could talk a bit about your experiences at your time with UCL and what do you think the value of your education actually was?
Sure, yeah, really interesting question. I think if you'd asked me when I started my degree, I would probably just say it's for getting me a job. I guess I still think that to an extent, but I think it's more than that. I think it's more about perspective. It's about helping you build your exposure. And especially at a place like UCL, the international exposure especially is important. I think more than that as well, it's about helping you understand your place in the world and where you want it to be. I think all of those really build together, and that's what helps you understand where you want to be, the perspective you get at university, the learnings that you get, all the people that you meet, and ultimately, I think that's what helps you get a job. So I guess it's all linked, but there's a lot of different things that go into it. But I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks on the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do, as another recent graduate, I do completely agree with that. I think obviously at the moment, job hunting is also a very, very interesting thing to be doing. So May, perhaps if you'd like to add something to that.
Yes, of course. Well, I think most people go to university today and sometimes get themselves into tricky positions, borrowing money or, because it's a massive investment, to study what they like and to further their education, but also sometimes to get away from their family or to discover a new place in the world, as is often the case in international universities, meet people. And I think this is what truly makes the values of an international university, is that you can meet people from all over the world. But what I really value in university education, more than the actual academic knowledge that you get, is how it can sometimes empower you to take action and change the world or make it become what you want it to be. So I think universities are really valuable for that.
Thank you very much. And Barney, so you're obviously still at UCL. As a current student, what would you say your perspective is at the moment? What are you getting out of your degree? What are kind of some of the key things that you're getting from UCL at the moment?
I think one of the issues is it's going to vary a lot depending on what you're studying, right? And some degrees are quite vocational. They'll have a very like skill-based element, and it's hard to get those skills outside of an intense educational environment like a university. But some are a lot more nebulous. You know, if you're studying something like English literature, the skills you're gaining are a lot harder to pin down, and sometimes you might wonder if you're getting any skills at all. So it, you know, I think it really changes depending on what you study. But I think the one thing I would say in response to the, you know, initial question of like, what is an education, you know, university education for, is I think we have to maybe, or I would say we have to accept the premise that you probably don't know. The nature of an education is that you're, if you knew it already, if you knew what you were going to get, then you wouldn't need to go and, you know, spend 3 years scratching your head doing it. The nature of it is that you don't know what you're going to get. And maybe you enter it going, oh, I'm going to try and learn this kind of thing, but you might come out of it with a totally different set of skills or interests or worldview. So I think part of it is a kind of willingness to not have a clue what you're going to get out of it.
Thank you so much, Pani. I very much do relate to that. And I think my own view of university has also changed vastly from kind of my first year going into it, having absolutely no idea what I'm expecting, to now as a graduate, actually looking back on it retrospectively and thinking about the skills that I've learned, the new perspective that I've gained. And I also think you raised a really interesting point, which was about, you know, the variance between the different courses. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I, for example, studied an arts degree. And I think it's quite interesting when you do talk about the SDGs to consider, you know, how can they be implemented into arts courses. So just to go back to May there, May, I know you also did an undergrad in the arts, and obviously now you're studying an MA in the social sciences. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about that and how you kind of actually came to get involved in sustainability when doing a vastly, or, you know, a sort of traditionally non-related degree.
Yeah, my degree was truly very, very academic, and it's very unclear how I would have gotten the skills to get a job with just this degree. And actually the story of how I got into a social science master's, and I'm now at the University of Edinburgh studying global environment, politics and society, is because on the side of my studies, I was also very, very involved with all things sustainability or environmental related. So my sort of part-time job as sustainability officer really earned me some like truly useful skills which are applicable to the world. But also on the side, I was the UK referent for a charity called the Climate Collage, with which we do climate education based on the IPCC report. And that also gave me the knowledge necessary to transition towards this different masters that I'm doing now. But so yeah, it was really, I like to say that I kind of did a 3 subjects degree, 2 very academic topics and 1 more practice oriented and led by me entirely area of sustainability and environment. And yeah, work that I did.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, it's really, really interesting hearing about the variety of work that you're doing. And also, you know, as you're saying, sometimes you do have to do a lot of things which are extracurricular, maybe outside of your kind of traditional degree of what you're learning in the classroom. It's also been really great seeing the responses to the active poll. And I think it's fascinating seeing the kind of range of answers that we're getting. And I think this is definitely something that universities have to keep in mind, how wildly students' expectations vary and how much universities have to sort of adapt to meet these demands. Now, just leading on from that discussion, I think it's very important to consider how embedding the SDGs into the curriculum can actually complement these expectations from the students. So Jane, I'd really love to hear your perspective here. Obviously, as an academic, you're coming at it from the kind of the opposite direction, I guess you could say. So how would you say embedding SDGs into our learning can actually complement these expectations?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully not coming from the opposite point of view. I think that's a really key point. I think what's very interesting about teaching in this area is it does lead to a sort of sharing of hopes and expectations, and the SDGs do provide a sort of a focus point for talking about the goals that we share, or the goals that we want to pursue as a university and after university as well. I think though that in terms of how SDGs help in terms of pursuing some of those really interesting aims that people want to, or pursuits that people want to get out of coming to university, and as May said, making such a huge investment now in that, is I think the SDGs can sometimes be used as a sort of a tick box or a label for certain activities, certain learning expectations, where I think the real value of embedding SDGs in our teaching and our learning comes from, and that's learning for staff as well as students, obviously, is that when one begins to start thinking about the connections and the relationships between the SDGs, I think that's where you can have some really interesting discussions between different disciplines, between teachers, between students, and learn from each other. And so I think I suppose the benefit is that they introduce the possibility of talking about complexity in a way which is in depth. So that from my own teaching, and we're still trying to develop and embed sustainability within courses in laws and other disciplines as well. That's the thing that I've taken from the SDGs, that they're a starting point in terms of discussions. They're not an end point, but they help us have better discussions about complexity and trade-off and relationships. And in an interdisciplinary way, they open up avenues towards interdisciplinarity, which I think is really important.
Thank you so much, Jane. I think that was really nicely put. And I think, again, you've raised a really, really important point there, which is that, the SDGs, as you said, can seem like quite a sort of simple, straightforward tick box exercise, but actually, they're sort of symbols for these massive, massive challenges that we're facing. And I think we do need to ask ourselves how do we actually trickle down this kind of cross-disciplinary research from the sort of top of UCL to the teaching and learning in the classroom to cover such a breadth of different subject areas as well. So thank you very much. Now, Lincoln, how would you say the SDGs were playing a role throughout your time at UCL when it comes to, for example, RISE-Sync? Could you tell us a bit more about how that came about and what role UCL actually played in the creation of that project?
So how we came about, how RISE-Sync came about was essentially in response to the competition I mentioned before. So what happened was UCL held an event where they encouraged students to come up with a business solution that was for purpose, but also for profit. And each year they focused on the competition focuses on a different SDG. So on our year, it was on the topic of energy, and one of the fields they highlighted was how do you harness energy in the area of agriculture to impact 10 million people by 2025. And it wasn't just us that participated. They were, I think, in our year, there were over about 50 to 100 students, and I think there were about 4 times that amount in the following year. So what you saw was that you actually saw a lot of students taking time out to develop real-life solutions and thinking how the SDGs, with the SDGs as the focus of these real-life solutions. And I think that actually provides a very interesting model for education, especially because back then, I took several courses that were slightly out of biomedical sciences, which I think UCL is quite a bit better than other universities from my friends in other universities, where we have the option, we have a bit more flexibility in choosing courses. That they actually became interesting case studies for us, because I think that many times when you're trying to do a new initiative, or at least speaking from someone who started his own company, when you're trying to start companies, many people overlook, everyone wants to come up with the next big idea to change the world. But many people forget that to look at the problems instead of the ideas first. And I think what the SDGs do is that they basically highlight the biggest problems in the world. So you don't really have to spend so much time trying to dig and rediscover a problem. It's essentially highlighted in the SDGs. And actually, if you use these problems to be a guiding light to whatever you do, a project, initiative, a company, an NGO, it becomes a lot more sustainable, because a lot of unexpected things might happen, like COVID-19, but the problem won't ever change. Like our problem was essentially food waste and hunger. It's not going to go away. No matter how we tackle it, it's still going to be there. So it gives you a very, I think what it provides for students in particular, if they were trying to do something about how the SDGs provide a guiding light for the students, a problem that is there, that needs to be solved and can be tackled in many ways. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lincoln. It sounds like a really, really great project to get involved in. So well done again to you. It's very, very, very impressive. And this leads us on very, very nicely onto the next part of our discussion, which is about how do students engage with the SDGs through extracurricular activities. Now, this is something which once again came up in the in session 2, the previous session that I did about universities and sustainability. So I think it's, yeah, as previously mentioned, it's very important to not only sort of advance our learning in the classroom, but to advance it through extracurricular activities and initiatives, some of which we've already mentioned. So May, if you maybe want to start us off again there, I think there was also an audience question for you, just once again, how you actually got involved in all these extracurricular things, and throughout your time as a sustainability officer, you know, what were maybe some of the other initiatives that students could have gotten involved in?
There are plenty. UCL is massive, and there's lots to get involved with. How I got involved with becoming a sustainability officer is through, in second year, I was part of a group called the Sustainability Ambassadors, which is the group I now took and transformed into something much bigger, and which is now part of the UCL administration, where everyone here listening can get involved in and potentially lead their own projects or serve a role of, you know, bringing more ambitious targets or helping UCL achieve its really ambitious targets for 2030 and 2050 in terms of like becoming net zero emissions and everything. But yeah, how I got involved at first was through my connection with the former sustainability officer. Then I took on the election and got elected as the next sustainability officer. I wanted to do a lot of things, and I found out that I wouldn't be able to achieve any of them if I were just alone. So I gathered a team of the next generation of sustainability ambassadors, sorry. And at this stage, instead of leaving this as a free floating group, I created specific roles for each and every of them. So we had an education officer, a campaigning officer, a UCL development officer, and I ended up dividing those groups, those 15 people, into 3 main groups. Education, we had Evans, well, education was part of Evans, development, and communications. Evans, development, communication. And all the students were able to just get in touch with proper university administration members. And this is how we've been able to lead many projects, such as campaigning against for different ways of traveling, or making the Climate Collage UCL happen. And at a few weeks later, I created another movement, which is the Environmental Collective, and which intended to gather students, staff, societies, individuals, all together to create collective action. And that's where we organized big climate strikes, a date with Earth, so plenty of events to get involved with. This is still happening. You can also join. What you can join too, and there's an event for that tomorrow, is you can become part of the next revolution in education that we're planning at UCL, which is the climate education kickoff. We are from the belief that we need, despite this environmental emergency, many students at UCL get their degree without ever hearing about the SDGs or about the climate emergency, or ever getting the skills or the knowledge necessary to take action. And what we're doing is, with this workshop, 3 hours workshop, which summarizes the IPCC report, we truly empower people to take action through knowledge. And this is what we're planning to make happen next. So do get involved with that if you want. Have I answered your question?
Yes, thank you so much, May. That was great. And I think, yeah, you raised a really interesting point. I think someone mentioned this in one of the questions as well, is that, you know, it's great for us to sit here and talk about the SDGs, but for a very large proportion of the students, they might go through their entire time at university never hearing about them. So we do have to ask ourselves, how do we get these people on board? People who might have absolutely no idea what we're talking about, who in no way, shape or form have been involved with sustainability. And as you said, the UCL campus is massive. And it might seem like it's very easy to find out about all these wonderful things going on, but actually sometimes if you're not in that bubble, it's not at all. So I also just want to pose the same question to Barney, because I know you mentioned obviously Architecture Declared, which you started. Do you have anything to add to that at all, Barney?
Yeah, I was thinking something while May was speaking, because May makes it sound very easy because she's very good at things, probably. But I think actually there's something really valuable here. There was a question earlier which was like, should I focus on extracurricular stuff or will my degree suffer? Someone asked in the thing. And I think one of the things that's really, if you're, you know, keen and want to do stuff, well, it's a win-win, because the fact is there's no like structure to how you set this stuff up. There's no pre-existing like ladder. There's no handbook for how to do it. And that's precisely why it's such a valuable way to spend your time. Education in general, and especially more so the last couple of decades, is incredibly structured. You have this course, you get this mark, this is how it's assessed, yada, yada, yada. And we become really good at navigating these like highly structured educational environments. But as soon as you step outside of that and you say, well, maybe I'll set up this campaign, or maybe I'll do this thing, like what May's done, you know, I'm just going to create these positions in order to formalize this structure or whatever. That's just like, I sound like I'm being glib, but that's just improvising. That's just figuring it out. That's just looking at the problem and going, oh God, I don't know, how do we do this? And then you decide. And that's the value of it. That's like why it's such a good use of your time. So I'm thinking about the person who's asking, should I worry about my degree or should I worry about this extracurricular stuff? You know, there's immense value in both, and it's going to be down to what kind of thing you care about. But I do think there's a lot of truth in the idea that the stuff that you will get most out of and that you will come away from your education going, oh, that really stuck with me all these years, will be the things that were completely off the map. We're not charted, we're not in the structure. No one said, here's the module where you're going to learn how to, you know, organize stuff like this, because, you know, that's just not how formalized education works. So I think there is a huge amount of value in the kind of unstructuredness of it. And, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, it's probably quite unusual for someone to ask you what degree you got, or what, you know, whether you got a first or a two. I did a degree before this. I've never been asked in my entire life. And that's not to say you won't be. It depends what field you go into. There are other things, you know, but it's not where the value in education is, in my view. And I think extracurricular stuff can be really useful for that reason. And certainly in terms of architecture education declares, yeah, you know, you wing it, you have to figure it out. There's no right answer.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I really agree with that point. And I just wanted to say that in terms of the unstructured learning that you get through running your own projects, doing new things, even just through my experience, which was at Engineers Without Borders, UCL, it was a society, so it already did have some structure. But I think the value you get from doing these things in a still kind of a cocoon of university, it's the perfect place for it, because you go into the real world and it's so much harder. But then if you have that experience before of having started something completely from scratch at university, I think you just have so much more confidence. And I think that it was so much easier for me to leave university and say, oh, I want to do this thing by myself now, because I'd already done that. Even if it was in a more protective environment, I'd already started something by myself. I'd already started network with people. I'd already brainstormed these ideas. I'd already done a lot of these things that you need to think about when you want to start something new. So now it's not as much of a daunting task as it would have been otherwise.
Thank you, Isha. Yeah, I have to say I completely agree with both of you. You know, when I look back at my time at UCL, don't know if that sounds terrible to say, but I feel like 90% of my experience was extracurriculars, the people that I met, the societies and the projects that I did. and maybe 10-20% was the kind of academic side of it. Not to devalue it in any way whatsoever, but I do feel like when it comes to job hunting, or just in general, for me at least, that was kind of where the vast majority of the value lay. And also, I think going back to what you've said, Barney, I think, you were saying that improvisation is very, very important, and a lot of the time you have to adapt and you have to kind of figure things out by yourself. And I think that's never really been more important than it is right now. Obviously, we're facing a global pandemic. Let's not forget about that. And I think it's really, really interesting how that's kind of affected our education and our work. So I just wanted to lead on to the next question, which is what you think the opportunities and the challenges of the pandemic are, both when it comes to higher education in general, but also obviously more specifically when it comes to tackling the SDGs. So Lincoln, if you just want to start us off on that, what do you think might be some of the largest opportunities and challenges that we're faced with right now, both as students or as recent graduates?
Okay, well, I guess the challenges are, not to say straightforward, but they're quite widely known especially for students and recent graduates. Movement is very restricted. We can't meet the people we want to meet all the time. We can't actually see and do the activities we want to do. I think for recent graduates, I guess the biggest boundary would be job hunting in this climate, as we've spoke about before. It's very interesting, and it's very different, I guess. But what I think the main opportunities that I believe COVID-19 has sort of opened up is everyone is at the same time inaccessible, but also accessible, because everything has shifted online. There is sort of this breaking down of hierarchies, and you only have to scour the net to see like extremely entertaining, slightly humorous stories of, for example, of how students have to basically walk their professors through how to actually conduct an online class. But I believe this actually breaks down the hierarchies in both companies, institutions like universities, and even student organizations like CCAs and clubs, to allow people to be on a more, I guess, even playing field, where you could theoretically, if everyone is online in a call, you could reach out to anyone. And everyone is also at home, so everyone has a lot more time. And a lot of the times what we've seen when we reach out to other organizations, or when my friends who are now coming into the first year of their jobs, they're spending a lot more time engaging with people at the top, because the people at the top have a lot more time, which they didn't have before. They have a lot more time to engage with us. And I think that allows people to drive change within organizations easier, because you would get face time with people you otherwise wouldn't have done. For students in particular, I think this allows them, like building on what my fellow panelists have said just now, which I completely agree, that it's when you try to do something outside of the structured form of formal education where you actually gain something, which is more often than not what is mostly talked about when you're actually trying to do the very thing the formal education was supposed to achieve, which was to help you get a job. That's the thing they talk to you most about. Like, I don't think I've got any questions asking me how my biomed degree was. They all want to know what we did in order to win the prize. And the same for all my friends, any one of them who were involved in a club, or any of them who started initiatives. I think what COVID-19 offers is actually there is more, people have more time to entertain new initiatives. People are more open to it as well. And there's actually more opportunities. There's a statistic that went up that I think post-pandemic, or well, we're still in the pandemic, the number of initiatives, NGOs and startups has exponentially increased, because people have a lot more time. People have seen a lot more opportunities, and they've taken advantage of it. And I believe so. I believe that the pandemic offers a lot of opportunities with this breaking down of hierarchies and this ability to knowledge share and interface with the higher levels of people or inaccessible people that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to access. And students should take advantage of that. Not just, spend 8 hours on a Zoom like for your lectures. You should also spend time actually trying to set calls up with other people who you are interested in, who you think you could start something with, even from your dorm rooms. Because I think at this point anything is possible. So yeah, that's what I believe is the opportunities in this pandemic.
Thank you so much, Lincoln. Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, of course, it is an extremely challenging time, but I think we do also have to, as you said, make the most of the opportunities and be as innovative as possible. Now, Jane, I'd also love to get your perspective here in terms of what you think some of the opportunities which have arisen might be from an academic's point of view. You know, how would you say this has affected teaching? And I think there was also a question that came up about the value of an online or a semi-online degree. So how would you feel about that?
Well, in terms of COVID and us responding as teachers, I mean, it's thrown so much up in the air, and I suppose it's you know, partly we're trying to manage in the best way that we can, but it has also opened up opportunities for rethinking the organisation of what we teach, and I suppose it's made us, I hope, more responsive to concerns by students. One thing I've found really marked in this period is the opportunities for want of a better word, upward mentoring in terms of students' technological prowess, in terms of delivery, in terms of being much more nimble, much more adept at working online. And I think there are some real opportunities there, not just in terms of technology and upward mentoring in terms of delivery of material, but also I think because we are all in the same boat, we're all trying to manage a difficult situation. I think it hopefully opens up opportunities for conversations about what we teach as well as how we teach. That's my real sincere hope. And I was worried initially that this period, this difficult period, that there would be some sort of retrenchment in terms of sustainability. But what we found, I think, and what we've seen as researchers and as teachers through the period of the pandemic and preparing for work this term, is that actually it's brought to the fore the issues that we're really concerned about, like fairness and equality and justice, all of which are absolutely key and core to sustainable development. I think it was Barney who mentioned or maybe Lincoln mentioned that, you know, the paradox of being present and being not present. You know, in some ways there is a liberation in terms of being able to reach people in an easier way. But I take the point of the questions coming through. The reduced interaction is obviously, you know, severely limiting, but I think hopefully it will open up the sort of shaking up might take us back to some sort of basic principles. In law, it has done so certainly in terms of thinking, as I say, about justice and fairness and equality. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, I mean, you're completely right. It is making us rethink all these various things. And I think going back to basics even more, I think, Barney, this is something you've spoken about in the past, is that the pandemic is actually making us rethink, you know, what is a university when we are all scattered across the globe, when there is this reduced interaction, when we're not all sitting in a classroom together. What do we actually refer to as a university when we don't have that physical space to congregate in? So yeah, Barney, do you have anything to say about that?
I suppose, I think, you know, the old saying, is it an old saying? Probably it's an old saying that, you know, every crisis is an opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's definitely a lot of truth in that. I think the first thing to acknowledge is that in a fairly general sense, it just sucks right now. And there's probably lots of like first years, or it doesn't matter what year you're in, trying to study right now. And it's just really, really, really hard because maybe maybe your situation is not comfortable. Maybe you're just lonely. Maybe you just hate Zoom calls. I hate Zoom calls, you know. And I think we don't need to beat around the bush and pretend that this is like thrillingly great, because in a very basic emotional sense, for a lot of people, it's not. But as everyone said, there is opportunity here. And I think there's a really interesting question of like, whose opportunity is it? And who is actually in a position to take an opportunity here? Because students have some agency, and like Lincoln's saying, I think there probably will be students, in fact there are students, you know, who will use the kind of freedom and flexibility afforded by what is effectively a completely networked, dispersed university, effectively a virtual university right now, to be really enterprising and adventurous and will set things up and do stuff. But I don't think it's reasonable or fair to count on that kind of ingenuity to be the kind of drive to take advantage of what opportunity this crisis affords. Really, I think responsibility for that lies with senior decision makers within the university, people who actually decide the policies within university, both the UCL and across the UK more broadly, and people who are at the end of the day, responsible for the university structure and the educational structure that in various ways we all pass through or are kind of inside of. And I think on that level, the opportunity has to be that as soon as you're presented with this kind of practical challenge, like what Jane was saying about having suddenly being in a situation where you've got students teaching their teachers how to do a thing, or, you just kind of have this kind of erosion of hierarchy and the immediacy of it, the urgency of it, the fact it's all happening at such short notice. We've come back to university, even though every scientist said that this was dumb. There's currently some college professors, making a legal case that it was illegal for the government to do this. So I think remembering how urgent and improvised it all has been, what I hope will happen is that the administrative structures and the managers who decide policy will see how effective and powerful the student-teacher relationship is when it is trusted to be the real engine of education. Because the engine of education, in my view at least, is not having a clear structure for your assessment, blah, blah. That's all fine and important and has a place. But actually what's great is that you've got teachers and students improvising how they're going to do their course together. Deciding, I had a seminar this morning with a great history and theory tutor at the Bartlett, who openly said, we're going to have to figure out together how we run this seminar series, because we don't have a precedent, we don't have a great structure for it, but we'll find a way of doing it that's going to be really effective. And that to me is the really exciting bit, because what that is putting front and center the kind of power that teachers have, which has been stripped away quite systematically for the last 30, 40 years.
Can I just add a point, Tanya, on that? I think that's...
Yes, of course, Jane.
I think Barney's points are really interesting, and we're seeing, I'm not talking just about UCL, I'm talking more generally in the sector, the stresses and strains are being exposed very, very clearly, and the stresses and strains on students as well as staff as well, very important. But just to add to Barney's, I think, very well made points about assessment, what happened at the end of last term was really instrumental in making us think seriously about how we assess students. And to some extent, one might argue the redundancy of a 3-hour exam compared to what we got from a more reflective assessment. So I think it's about delivery, but it's also important, if we work back, it's also about how we assess students as well. That's really important, and how students want to be assessed, how they think their skills are going to be best judged and taken forward.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, I think that's is definitely really, really interesting to consider. I think, again, for me as a kind of final year student at the end of last year, assessment was a complete shambles, and I, hats off to my tutors. I think they did a wonderful job at trying to keep everything ticking. But as Barney said, I think it does have to be an extremely collaborative process. And I do think at least my department could have benefited a lot more if there was a more direct conversation between the student body and the staff. So I don't know if any of the other panelists have anything to add to that when it comes to assessments and kind of student-teacher relationships. Perhaps Isha or May?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how, I guess beyond student teacher, it's also about student mentor, because I was quite fortunate to be a part of a department that has a really close-knit relationship between a lot of the lecturers and teachers and students, and it really went beyond what happened in the lecture theater. It was a lot more collaborative. We had a lot of projects that we worked on with teachers, and I personally did complete a research project with someone in the department simply because I would see her going around the department quite often. So I just went up to her and asked her, and I think she mentored me a lot. And similarly, with our engagement with faculty as a part of Engineers Without Borders, we would go up to a lot of lecturers. We just like their research or something, and you would ask them, hey, do you want to help us develop this project, or hey, do you want to come and talk with some of the students that are interested in energy or in waste or something like that. And I think we were able to develop a lot of really personal relationships with these teachers. And I really think about COVID, and I think about the fact that students at UCL now can't really experience that. They don't have that personal relationship with the teachers anymore. And I think that that's something that needs to be considered when we move forward. How do you replicate that sort of informal mentorship in this virtual setting? And is this experience teaching us more about the importance of that, or is it something that's forgotten? I don't know. I don't have the answers to this. I was just thinking about it, just stray observations, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I think in response to that, one thing that can radically change the way we do online education is simple things such as asking questions before you begin a seminar or a lecture. How are you? How are you feeling today? Really helps create a humane relationship between the teaching staff and and students who are there to learn, but also who would appreciate, I think, having more or a stronger relationship with the teaching staff, also in terms of like sharing what research is being done at UCL or encouraging cross-disciplinary research at UCL. I think this can be really strong ways of doing that, simply asking mundane questions.
Thank you, May. Yeah, I completely agree. I think we really cannot underestimate the value of these interdisciplinary approaches, both to research, to teaching, and just in general, all these various relationships which the university environment should be fostering. I think another quite interesting thing when it comes to these things such as student-teacher relationships, assessment, and whatnot is Moodle. I know that Barney, you had something to say about that in the past. Do you want to just talk a bit about whether there might be a relationship actually between Moodle and the SDGs?
Sure, I suppose this is more me just being provocative, but I think it's a fun little exercise, because I suppose what I think is great about the SDGs is that they, by virtue of being, a set of very different challenges in a way, but by virtue of being all together labeled as the UN SDGs, they kind of implicitly say these things are all connected. They say that gender equality is connected to wealth inequality, is connected to climate justice, is connected. Okay, that's the reason they're powerful, because they all exist on the same platform and they implicitly show that connection. So the reason I was harking on about Moodle was because I think it's a fun kind of question we can ask ourselves as students and as teachers and as professional staff within UCL who interact with all these kind of tools, is to what extent is the type of environment we create for ourselves and the tools we use to navigate that environment connected to our ability or inability to feel engaged by questions like, how can UCL help with the SDGs? And I like having a go at Moodle because I hate Moodle. I think Moodle's really bad and really dumb, and I'm sorry if someone out there loves Moodle. I've never met anyone who loves Moodle, so. But I think I mostly pick on it because it's like a little symbolic. It's like it's an emblem for a certain understanding of education, a certain highly sanitized, highly centralized, highly managerialized form of education that, in my mind, because of its commercial imperative, because of its kind of pseudo-consumer market relations, is incompatible with a meaningful engagement with, e.g., the SDGs. Now, am I actually saying that Moodle is like the big bad here? Obviously not. There's a totally benign version of Moodle, but I think we can ask ourselves, like, what about our sense of a university experience and our sense of what an educational environment might be actually necessitates or even demands or is made easier by the introduction of these kinds of tools and platforms, which are forced often on teachers who maybe don't really want to use them, or maybe some are happy to try and use them and navigate all the buttons and stuff. But what does it actually do? And what, and how does it actually shape our environment? So that it's me being a bit provocative, because obviously it's a bit far-fetched, but I would love to know what people think of Moodle and what they think of it as an emblem of their environmental, their educational environment.
Thank you, Barney. Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting perspective, and definitely something I hadn't necessarily considered before, even though I use Moodle honestly pretty much every day throughout my education. So thank you for making me somewhat rethink that, or at least consider what I actually think about it. And I think you made another good point, and this is a question that I'd like to open up to all the panelists, which is actually, as you said, Barney, to what extent is a meaningful engagement with the SDGs actually possible in the current education sector, being as commercialized as it is? So I don't know if any of you guys want to go first.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but I've always been of the opinion that we need engagement from everyone. It's the SDG 17, right? Partnerships for the goals. And I don't think that excluding any part of the education system, excluding any part of any system really, however commercialized it may be, is possible if we really want to meet the SDGs. So I think it's not the question of whether it's possible, it's more about how do we do it, even if it seems impossible.
Thank you, Isha. And maybe Lincoln?
I think I'll probably build on Isha's point, because the first thing that this question, the first thing that pops up to you is that it's not going to be possible. Like, that meaningful engagement with SDGs in a very highly commercial space is sort of illogical. Like, commercial and SDGs are normally seen as opposites. But I think, coming from someone who works in a company that focuses on the SDGs for both to achieve the SDGs and for profit at the same time, I think the challenge, especially in this social enterprise space, is that there is actually a shift right now to sort of build a focus on how can we be commercially sustainable while being actually sustainable. And if you actually want to do it right, it takes a lot of commitment, especially from the largest commercial players, if you actually want to make a big difference. Because it doesn't matter if, like, if I be blunt, like, for example, if 1,000, for example, like, as we work in food, right? It doesn't matter if 1,000, I guess, small restaurants shift their supply chain, for example, to source sustainably. You get tons of these shops with who market sustainability, but what will be a big difference is if the top 10 most valuable food companies in the world suddenly decide that they want to be sustainable. And so then the challenge is then, how do you inspire or how do you engender change within the top levels of these organizations to actually see that there is there's no escaping it. They got their companies to where they are today by being commercially focused. So how could you engender change by allowing the people at the top to see that being sustainable is also better commercially? I don't think that there's a straight, like, one size fits all answer for this, for sure. And it's probably one of the most difficult problems to answer. But if we tackle that problem, I definitely think this is possible, that engagement with SDGs in a highly commercialized education sector is possible. It's like, if it made sense for the if engagement for the SDGs actually meant that universities would do better, even in, like, the most, I guess, unpopular way, where the universities will make more money, for example, right? It would just happen overnight, because, I mean, that's how it's been run, and that's how it's going to change. And there's a debate on whether that sort of motivation is actually good to engender change and focus on the SDGs, but it does show that you do need these stakeholders involved. You do need to have you do need to have the perspective, someone coming from a commercial perspective, if you want meaningful engagement of the SDGs. If not, it would always just be sort of an echo chamber where you get the same stakeholders who don't have that commercial stake trying to push for change and sort of depending on the whims of the decision makers. Yeah.
Thank you, Lincoln. I mean, yeah, as you said, obviously, I think it is quite a daunting task engendering change at absolutely all levels, and not only working from the bottom up, but actually starting at the top and working down as well. But equally, I think you've got a really nice sort of positive attitude, you know, when you're saying that, yes, commercial sector and SDGs might seem sort of inherently opposed to some, but actually there would be a lot more sense of people kind of realize the actual benefits of getting on board with the SDGs and the benefits that it might actually have for them. Yeah. I think we just have time for a couple of quick more points from the panelists before we go on to the Q&A. So May, if you just want to say anything else on this topic, that'd be great, and then we'll move on to the audience questions.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic. I think I think the SDGs are completely not contradictory with having a commercialized education. I think, but for the first reason, which is that the SDGs are about economic development as well. The second reason being that as we've all become stakeholders of our universities, we can make stronger demands for our universities to change too. And I think universities or companies are increasingly sensible to this. But I still get the feeling that even though we are demanding, for instance, for sustainable education for all, or like climate education for all, this has been a demand that was generated during the last Student Sustainability Council, for example. But universities are still a bit chilly sometimes if it's, for instance, something that hasn't been implemented before. Speaking from experience with the climate collage, for instance, this is something that works really well in France. We've been providing climate education for nearly all institutions in France. But now we're having discussions with UCL to try and make this happen too. And UCL is, of course, one of the first internationally to be taking on the project, and it can be a bit daunting for them as well. So what helps in this case scenario is to know that there are other institutions who are interested in the project. And now the Climate Collage Initiative has received an offer from the Global University Climate Forum to be implemented worldwide. And so that's a very interesting thing for us to work with. So yeah, to have universities worldwide or key stakeholders at the top level supporting each other as well, or influencing themselves, is also very, very important, as well as having a bottom-up demand.
Thank you, May. And yeah, definitely, I think very, very important to have a very international approach. And it's great to be hearing what institutions in other countries are doing as well. I think, as always, communication is key, and we do need to be looking and communicating with other institutions, sharing knowledge, sharing research, and working on these things together. So thank you so much. That pretty much wraps up the first part of the panel discussion. And now we'll move on to the audience Q&A. So please keep sending in your questions, and we'll be going through them one by one. So to start off with, the top question is, why do the SDGs need to be extracurricular? Should we not be trying to make them core curricular? So I don't know if perhaps Jane, you'd like to answer that first. I don't know if maybe we've been talking a bit too much about the extracurriculars this session, and we haven't actually covered kind of implementation of the SDGs into the core curriculum so much today. Yeah, Jane, if you'd like to start us off, I'd love to hear your point of view.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's a really valid question. And I was interested to see it also linked to questions about Moodle and how you could actually use Moodle in a creative way. I mean, I think I'll come back to Moodle in a minute, but in terms of why do SDGs need to be extracurricular, I think that obviously, ideally, we'd like to, I think embedding SDGs refers to the inclusion of sustainability throughout the courses that are offered. However, I mean, it's a slow process. It's difficult. It's there are pockets of not resistance, but pockets of difficulty in terms of doing that. And I wonder if just to think about other aspects of SDGs more broadly, I think that there are two things that are maybe relevant here. I think one is actually the informal curriculum. So that's not sort of social, societies and extracurricular in a formal way, in a distinct way, but the way that the informal curriculum operates is how the estate operates, how decision-making is done in the university, how the university responds to and invites in the wider community, how gender relations are dealt with within the university, and racial relations and so on. That, in other words, it's the environment that we work in, that we learn in, that is just as important. And I think that UCL has made real strides. I mean, the work of the estate and work of professional services, there's been some real movement in terms of trying to align the wider environment with the SDGs. So that's just a point about it. I don't think it's necessarily just a division between extracurricular and curricular. I think there's something else which is more, potentially very meaningful in terms of how we learn about SDGs. So it's just a quick point. Moodle, I could go on forever, but I'll maybe come back to Moodle at another point. But just for now, let's finish there. And I'd be interested to know some other views.
Thank you, Jane. So if anyone else has anything to add to that, I mean, I completely agree. I think that, in a dream world, it would be fantastic if we could automatically embed the SDGs into all of our learning. But I do think that there is a limit in terms of what academics can do in the classroom. And I think that things like the informal curriculum, which you mentioned, or the kind of more social extracurriculars, I think it's very important for both of them to go side by side. I definitely don't think it's a case of one over the other. They have to be extracurricular, they have to be in the core curriculum. But I do think that there should definitely be some kind of interrelationship between the two to drive learning both inside the classroom and outside of it. So I don't know what the rest of you guys think. That's been your experience at UCL as well. As we've discussed, so many of you have done both fantastic extracurricular things, but I'm just curious how you found the actual curriculum.
One point I'd like to make there is that I think the SDGs are by definition so interdisciplinary that the UK education system, which is so not interdisciplinary, I'm not sure to what extent it is even completely possible to embed them in the curriculum. And if you don't have the extracurricular aspect, then I'm not sure to what extent you would really understand the SDGs. I mean, just as an engineer, I guess it was still interdisciplinary enough that we had exposure to other things, but not to the extent that it's needed. I mean, I got exposure to the SDGs from a very engineering perspective. I didn't know a lot about the social sciences. I didn't really understand as much about the importance of communication, for example, or health, and a lot of different things that they just don't come up when you're in a very structured education system like we have in the UK.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Ishan. Going back to what we were saying earlier about some subjects kind of being more inherently, I think, aligned with the SDGs, others not. As someone who studied English literature, I wouldn't say that's an interdisciplinary subject at all. I mean, that was not something that was ever covered in the curriculum. It was very much, narrow field of vision. You're studying these texts, which are fantastic, but the SDGs were not ever something that was on my radar at all. So I do think that there is kind of a fault with the system itself that is just currently not allowing these things to be covered inside the classroom. And I wonder, Barney, if you might have anything to add to that as well, maybe something about the Bartlett.
Cool, I think, yeah, so Architecture Education Declares, which was this campaign that me and some other students set up, was very specifically focused on this question of where in the curriculum, where in the teaching does environment and climate sit. And in the case of our opinion, the literal case of where is it, because it should be here. And I think it might be useful, I'll try not to tangle myself up here, but I think maybe given what we're talking about, it might be useful to introduce a distinction between two kinds of engagement with the SDGs and the things they represent. And we might call it direct and indirect engagement. And I think some subjects are going to have far more direct engagement than others. Architecture is a case in point. the construction industry is responsible for huge amounts of environmental damage. It's, you know, toxic materials, masses of emissions. It's a huge thing, and it has huge implications for all kinds of challenges embodied in the SDGs, or how it's practiced. So architectural educators have a responsibility to make sure their students know that, understand that, learn that kind of stuff. And you know, learn their role in relation to it. That's a very direct engagement with some of the challenges in the SDGs. I think what we try to do with Architecture Education Declares, which is I think the really, really hard bit, and is the bit where we start to get kind of a bit political and a bit difficult, is the indirect engagement with the SDGs. And what I mean by indirect is a relationship to the challenges the SDGs embody that looks at the structures that give rise to those problems. That takes a much more distant structural analytical approach and says, okay, so why is there huge wealth inequality? Why is it that there are 100 companies who are responsible for 71% of global emissions? Why is it that women in countries all over the world are massively oppressed, you know, to the advantage of certain powerful interests, etc., etc.? And I think all subjects and all students and teachers can and should engage with those questions. And an English literature degree is as much concerned with those as an engineering degree. And I think it's there that we have the real challenge, because that, I think, is about introducing a kind of, quite a difficult kind of, and, you know, maybe a bit boring for some people, but a kind of structural critique and a kind of understanding, a view of the world that makes sense of these things. And just to relate a little bit to the previous question about a commercialized education sector, I think the question that's interesting there is that it forces us to locate UCL within the structure that we're then analyzing. So when we're saying, why is the oppression of women, why is the destruction of sea life, why are these things connected? And what has that got to do with a marketplace education? We have to start analyzing that and understanding that. And I think, I mean, my view would probably be that, you know, historically universities have been places of great disruption and protest and fomenting real unrest. You know, that's historically what they've been in countries, you know, not just here, but that's what students are kind of are. They're like professional agitators because they are engaged with that stuff. But that role has been massively sanitized, massively worn away in the last 30 years because of a commercialization of education and a sort of sense that there's a discrete product that you're meant to be getting and that your university is like teaching it to you. So I think the question for students is, how can they, within the context of that commercial sector where they are paying through the nose for this thing that might give them a job, through a, you know, via a university that feels huge amounts of pressure to make sure that their experience is equal and balanced and blah, blah, blah. How can they make demands of their university that force it to make that indirect engagement with the SDGs? And there are, you know, probably some answers, but I don't, but, you know, maybe we'll get to that. But yeah, I think the question of the curriculum thing is really interesting, because we can all put that indirect engagement in our curriculum, whatever you're studying. We can all find ways of understanding why the world is the way it is, whether it's culturally, whether it's, you know, scientifically, climatically, whatever.
Thank you so much, Barney. And just to pick up on one word that you used there, which was disruptive, if you could just summarize in a few sentences, what does a disruptive education mean to you? And this is open to the rest of the panel as well.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
I suppose it's one that recognizes that, well, it has to recognize two things, right? Your university as a student has this weird like double role. On the one hand, it's this authority figure, this like paternal like monster that you have to work for, and, you know, it kind of looks after you. But on the other hand, it's this hugely benevolent, incredible resource full of passionate, dedicated staff who really like love you and want you to do really well and think about things. I think a disruptive education is one that can somehow rebel against the former and demand things of it and say, no, I am not just a sort of supplicant who's going to sit here and take what you give me. I'm going to be really, really challenging. I'm going to say, I don't like the way this is being done. I'm going to occupy my library until you take away all these books. I'm going to, or add these books, don't take away books, you know, whatever it is, but that you can view your university as simultaneously a kind of an authority to be challenged, which it really is, while at the same time trusting your teachers and engaging with your classmates and so on in a really in a spirit of solidarity, because that's what they probably think. I guarantee most teachers will want students to do this.
Thank you, Barney. Does anyone else want to summarize what their version is of a disruptive university?
Can I just jump in terms of the points about partnership between staff and students? I've just got, you know, two quick examples which I think are really important aspects of UCL's recent history. One, of course, is the fossil fuel divestment campaign, where there was a great degree of an alliance between staff and students on that campaign to good effect. And a lot of learning on both sides was done, and students contributed hugely to the body of knowledge that was important in that campaign. That was really vital. The other aspect, I think, that we've seen recently, and this is possibly more controversial, is the support that was given to members of the UC Union for striking last February, March. I was really quite overwhelmed at times by the support, and there was a recognition that some of that campaign was concerned with the commercialization of education and the turning of a learning, a deep and meaningful learning experience into a student experience that needs to be paid for in some way. So I think that there are, you know, coming back to this idea about disturbance, there are pockets of not just disturbance, but pockets of resistance which are capable of joining up in relation to environmental justice and in relation to the SDGs as well.
Thank you so much, Jane. Yeah, I think the fuel investment campaign and the strikes are both really, really interesting examples, and they were very, very disruptive. So thank you for that. Maybe Lincoln, I don't know if you have anything to say about how you see a disruptive university.
To be honest, I think Barney's explanation was quite summarized sort of my thoughts, because to me a disruptive education is more of what he mentioned, second point, where you look at university as a place where you can challenge the system, challenge the way of thinking that's been embedded. And universities have been doing that students have been doing that in the past. And I think going back to that student-teacher relationship, I think in a disruptive education that will be key, because I think the more the students engage the academics and vice versa, I think that's where you really drive real change within the institution, because it's that relationship that's at the core of the institution. If without this relationship, without a strong relationship between a student and a teacher, you don't have a university. And I think students coming into university, they should make the most out of this opportunity to leverage this relationship. To people sometimes view disruptive as, some people view disruptive as bad, you know, like you're shaking up the system. But another point of view is that it's actually good. It forces you to actually think what is outdated, what is archaic, and what is new, and what actually makes sense, especially in a time like this, where, you know, essentially everything has been disrupted. So what sort of disruptive education are you actually looking for? I think a lot of the questions, some of the questions that came up previously was, well, what are we actually going to do with, you know, a degree that's partially online? Where's the value in that? You know, why am I controversial statement, but why am I paying so much for it? You know, all these sort of issues need to be discussed, not just by students and by academics, but also by the institution itself. They need to be tackled head on. You need a multi-stakeholder sort of discussion where everyone is sort of open to change. And I think that will provide the best form of education in the end, because that what you're doing is then you're developing education that actually has everyone's interest in mind, and everyone's working towards like, I guess, sort of a system that fulfills everyone's interests.
Thank you very much for that, Lincoln. Now, moving on to the next question, I think this is one that's come up a couple of times. So the question is, how can academics support both curricular and extracurricular activities to enable students to address the SDGs? So what is the role of academics in all this? I don't know who wants to answer this one.
Yeah, I think I can start off, I guess. I also kind of adding on to what Lincoln said earlier, I was thinking about how a lot of the things that students need in university to develop their interests, to develop their understanding of the SDGs and really the real world, I think, academics already have access to that. I think academics have that wealth of experience. Academics have the contacts, they have the understanding of what actually goes on in the real world. And I think there needs to be more of that emphasis on that academic student relationship, and going beyond that, helping the academic helping the student understand what is going on in industry, for example, or in multilateral institutions, which are really key to the SDGs. And I guess helping facilitate those relationships, those multi-stakeholder relationships that can help students develop, I don't know, projects or research that addresses the SDGs. I feel like there's a lot of that informally already at UCL, and that's something that's really unique to it. But I think there is definitely more potential for more formalized partnerships, more formalized platforms that help students, academics, professional staff, industry, institutions outside the university understand and access the support, collaborate on being disruptive.
Thank you so much, Isha. Now, for the next question from Joel, which is, from my research, it is widely accepted that the SDGs are unachievable by 2030, which is the deadline. Now, to what extent is the process more important than the end goal? I think that's a really interesting question. So I don't know who wants to cover this one. Is the process more important than the end goal?
This is quite similar to the climate crisis. We have a crisis which concerns the amount of CO2 emissions that are in the atmosphere at the moment. And we're not sure that we're going to be able to mitigate climate change soon enough. But that being said, it shouldn't be a reason for us to simply do nothing. We've seen that this doesn't work. There are still loads of opportunities for us to change the way the world works, the structures that underpin the world today and how it functions. So there is a lot of room for improvement on many things, many subjects today, whether it's inequality, racial inequality. And working towards implementing the SDGs is about trying to make this happen sooner rather than later, but for other reasons as well, just because it's better for all of us, also for our mental health, also for our general well-being. So yeah, that's why we should be focusing more on the journey rather than just the outcome.
Thank you, May. And Barney, I wonder if you agree with what May had to say, or do you have a different perspective?
Probably not radically different. I think what's useful about stuff like these targets, and similar to the climate targets, is that they give us a kind of, it's a bit like, I don't know, it gives us a contract to hold decision makers and lawmakers to account with. We can say, hey guys, these were the goals. Look how nothing's changed. Look how things have got worse. I guarantee some of these SDG things are going to be worse in 2030 than they were in 2020, 2000, let alone achieved. But setting these kinds of goals, having these kinds of targets is a really important way of measuring these things, because they give us tools to speak about them. They give us tools to hold our lawmakers and policymakers to account with. So I think, I probably agree with Joel. I'm not super optimistic in a way, but I do think having things like the SDGs in place is really important, because you have to have something to aim for. You have to have something to be able to prod your politician with, or your university professor with. And if we don't sort of solidify around specific targets, then that's much more difficult.
Thank you, Barney. Now the next question is, my flatmate studies law and she has never heard about the SDGs. This strikes me as a huge problem if our future lawyers or policymakers aren't aware of them. Another great question, I think, and kind of links back to what we were saying before in terms of, the amount of people that actually do go through the entirety of their higher education experience and really don't in any way touch base with the SDGs and aren't aware of them. So who wants to take this one?
Can I add a question to it for the rest of the panel? Because I think the interesting thing about this question, right, is that, okay, so yeah, the SDGs are huge, or they point to huge things that we're maybe all vaguely aware of. So the question I would want to ask is why? Why can someone studying a degree like law get through a university education and not be aware of these things? And in the broadest terms, why do we think that is?
Very interesting question. What I wanted to say is, while I find this hugely problematic, and I think what makes a disrupting university as well is a university that takes seriously their responsibility to educate their students on those issues, which are the most pressing issues in the world. We have, despite the environmental emergency, many students who will graduate and get their degree without ever hearing of the SDGs or of the climate crisis or how it works, even though these are key competences for the future as well. So I don't know, for someone like me who did philosophy and history of art, there was no way, I think, or especially in history of art, the SDGs or climate science could be ever included in my bachelor's. And that's where I think it would have been good for the university to on the side provide me with an opportunity to study that, whether it's through another module or through an external workshop. And this is where I'm really biased, because that's what I want to do with the climate collage. But that being said, I'll leave someone else to talk.
Thank you, May. And yeah, I think this is where, going back to Jane's point earlier about the kind of informal curriculum and the importance of that, I think this is where it could be really, really useful. And Jane, I wonder if you could answer the next question, which is, what do you think would need to change institutionally for universities and students to move closer to communities and explore their full potential? I'd love to get your point of view.
Okay, I'll just address the previous question, because obviously that's really disturbing. I had a brilliant time at the beginning of this year teaching on the Laws Connection course, which is our introduction to law to first years, and teaching a stream on climate change. So we are trying right from the beginning to include sustainability and justice and climate into the law degree, but that's obviously, we are still constrained by a degree which is set to some extent by professional needs and qualifications. And I think that raises an important question about taking these questions to a higher level, beyond the university, to the professional bodies that are setting the constraints of what we're teaching within the universities. But anyway, that was the previous question. I think really in terms of institutional changes, sustainability learning teaches us that we need to make partnerships with a broad range of people. And we've talked quite a lot this afternoon about the private sector and commercial sector. I think there's real space for opening up partnerships with the public sector and with charities and NGOs. And that's something which some students are not so aware of, because what's very present in careers fairs and so on is the commercial sector, particularly in law. We have an overrepresentation of the private sector in that field. So I'm really, I'm very sort of warmed by examples of partnerships with charities and NGOs that give students the opportunity to sort of see beyond commercial opportunities. And just one example, which I think is a brilliant pattern or template that could be adopted more widely, is a partnership that we've entered into the last few years with the Environmental Law Foundation, which is a really respected environmental charity, whereby that charity doesn't have a physical presence. Instead, it's decentralized, and it has formed partnerships with law schools throughout the country. And that gives students the opportunity to work on legal cases, legal problems, in a network of lawyers working in this area. And I think it's quite an interesting, as I say, an interesting pattern whereby there's much more sort of close connection between members of the, in this case, legal community, but it could be other disciplinary communities, and students in their university education. But that's just one example of the need for public-based partnerships. I'm sure there are many others from the other colleagues on the panel.
Thank you so much, Jane. Now I think we're just moving on to the final 1 or 2 questions here. So actually this, Jane, is very, very relevant to what you were saying earlier. A question from Marcus regarding the importance of the connections and the relationships between the SDGs. So which techniques facilitate their synergy most effectively, as well as SDG 17? So I don't know who wants to take this one, maybe May or Isha.
I'd be curious to hear what Lincoln would have to say about this.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, Lincoln, if you've got anything to add, please go ahead. It's a great question.
I think that the SDGs as a whole, if we're talking about the connections and the relationships between the SDGs are inherent. Okay, so some of the SDGs, I believe at some small point, because the SDGs are so interdisciplinary and so overarching, that they're all connected to one another. And the example that will come to the top of my head is probably what, for example, the problem that we're working on. We work on global hunger, but it is when we first entered the problem, we discovered that you can't talk about global hunger without talking about poverty. You can't talk about poverty without talking about social well-being, and it goes on and on and on. And so I think that what you then realize is that the techniques that facilitate their synergy most effectively, I think, well, if I come from it in the perspective of how does one actually achieve the SDG targets, is that it's impossible to just focus on one SDG and just say, I'm going to just solve this one SDG. You can prioritize which SDG you want to focus on, and that's perfectly fine because everyone has their specialization and what they're aiming for. But you must understand how they're related, how other problems feed into another solution, and how if you aren't, and how you most like, in order to actually tackle the problem, you most likely need some form of solution that is multifaceted, that tackles multiple solutions at once. You can have a priority on one problem, but it has to touch on the other problems and how you resolve these connections. And it doesn't have to necessarily be you doing it by yourself or an institution doing it alone. What you'll find is that just as how, for example, we specialized in tackling food waste, there will be another company or NGO or organization, university, student project that is focused on tackling perhaps poverty. And what will be effective is if we work together. And I think that is the most effective way. Partnerships are probably the most effective way to moving forward to tackle the SDGs. And I think even big organizations like the UN themselves who came up with the SDGs, the UN individually does not solve all the SDGs. They have different bodies tackling different parts of the SDGs, and each of those bodies have different partnerships with government, private sector, and civil society. in order to tackle the challenges, because it's so overarching and it involves so many different angles. So yeah, I think partnerships is probably the most effective way to tackle it, and while understanding the relationships between the SDGs.
Thank you, Lincoln. I think that was a great answer to what was quite a complicated question, and something that we could definitely spend probably a whole other session discussing for at least an hour or two. We are unfortunately running out of time, sadly, so we'll probably have to move on to our final question to the panelists. This is open to all of you, which is, I'd love to get just a few sentences in your own words on what would a utopian university look like to you. And while you guys can take a minute to think about that, thank you so much to our audience, and we'd love to get some of your thoughts in the comments. But yes, please feel free to jump in whenever you're ready. What would a utopian university look like to you?
Can I jump in?
Of course, Jane, please start us off.
I'd really like to see a university that its boundaries are open and really difficult to discern, so that there'd be proper engagement between local communities and students. And I'd also like to see a utopian university that really fosters well-being and mental health. And if I had one wish, I'd probably like to stop traffic in the immediate area in order that we could move around more freely in terms of the UCL specifically.
Thank you so much, Jane. And Barney, what's your version of utopian university?
I think in my utopian university, it's free. It's completely free. The cleaners are on secure contracts with holiday pay. So are the security guards. So are all of the teaching staff and the PhDs who do loads of teaching and all the professional services. The students range from people who have just finished school to people who are 70 years old and fancy doing a degree, and it's free and they can do that. And it's all subsidized by a state that recognizes the invaluable contribution that proper education makes to the society, and the immeasurable, and I mean literally immeasurable, I don't mean big, I mean not measurable value in investing in these things. So that's my utopian one. We can all just be in it whenever we want, and it'll be great.
Thank you, Barney. That sounds great. And Lincoln, would you like to go next?
I think Barney's version is already quite fitting, but quite utopian. But I think to add to that, I think a utopian university for me would be a place where every student, no matter where they're from, no matter how old they are, would get the education that they want, would be able to pursue what they actually want to learn and need to learn, and be able to access the proper tools for it. Yeah.
Thank you, Lincoln. And May?
Yeah, I think a utopian university for me is a place of human interaction without boundaries. I think it's a decolonized curriculum, and actually I can't think of anything more important than this. Oh yeah, having a free university would be much better, of course. But yeah, decolonize the curriculum and make it free.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I think, yeah, decolonizing the curriculum is something that's another thing I wish we had a lot more time to discuss. And it's a shame that's only coming at the end, but definitely something that's really important to consider. And finally, Isha, do you have anything to add?
No, I think I really want to go to the university that Barney proposed. I'm dreaming of it now, but
you're welcome. Come in.
Yeah, I think inclusivity would definitely be the top priority for me. And in addition to the freeness, obviously, but also I guess it's just so important for students to have a platform and a voice and the mentorship. And I think that's what I would want in my utopian university as well. I'd want that kind of support and helping students realize their goals and really the sustainable development goals while they're at it.
Thank you so much, Isha. And thank you so much to all of our 5 fantastic panelists. I think you've left us all hopefully with a lot of food for thought. It's been really, really great hearing both about the implementation of the SDGs in the curriculum, in the informal curriculum. It's been great hearing about all of your extracurricular activities and initiatives. And just in general, really, really nice and refreshing, I think, to get a much more student-led and student perspective on all these topics. And hopefully, together we can push UCL to address this even more and enhance student participation and get even more students on board when it comes to the all-important decision-making. And finally, thank you so much to our audience for joining. It's really, really great to see that you've enjoyed the session. Otherwise, thank you so much, and please do join us for the rest of the sessions for the conference. Thank you.